So now I'm going to be working on the snare drum. What I did have was a 14 by 10 marching drum that had been dropped on the snare throw, so it damaged the bottom half of the drum. So I've cut it down, and what you see here now is a 14 by 5.5 inch shell. Now I cut it down and then I spun it on the board to get this nice and flat, and I've discovered that the inner ply is mahogany, which is a nice surprise. So that's going to be, so it's a 3-ply mahogany, poplar mahogany, which is a nice configuration for a snare drum. What also I've done is I've just filled, this was originally drilled for the smaller Ludwig lugs, so I filled the bottom hole and then drilled another hole so that I can get Jazz Festival lugs in. Yeah, now I've put it under tension into this ratchet strap, and I've put a bit of the scrap shell underneath the ratchet strap to stop it from marking the shell. I've also measured across to make sure it's evenly under tension, so it's all nice and round. That's 14 inches all around. What I'm going to do now is install the support hoop that I took out of the bottom part of the shell, and here it is. I've just put PVA on the inside of the shell and on the support hoop. Now this support hoop has got snare beds cut into it, just there. So I want to be able to line that up in between two lug points here, around here somewhere. Yeah, so I'm going to put the support hoop in. I break mine so it's a bit easier to get in, so I'm just going to get it in, get into place. Just mark the shell in the position where the snare beds are, so not too much problem. I'm just going to clip that into place, just there. Now I'm going to get some bits of scrap shell, and that's where I'm going to that's what I'm going to use to clamp this, just like that. Now I'm going to use about maybe 10 or 12 clamps, so it's a bit boring to watch me put it on, but that's what I'm going to do. There's one on. So I'm going to do that all the way around, and then make sure it's nice and close to the edge. I want this to be absolutely perfectly tight in with the shell. So when I've finished, I'm just going to wipe the excess glue off and leave that for 24 hours, and that will be a really nice snare drum shell to work with. I'm really looking forward to seeing this one take shape. Okay, here's the 12-inch tom. Since you last saw it, I sanded the inside and painted it up a bit more of an authentic white Resicoat colour. What I did then was, after the paint had dried, I just spun it a little bit on the sandpaper just to get the paint off, and to get a nice line on the top where the support hoop is and the bearing edge, and then I just sort of sanded over the rest, maybe with a bit of a filing down just to make the edge nice. Checked it was flat, make sure the profile of the edges is good, and it is. I'll just show you. Nice looking authentic 60s bearing edge. Then I've drilled out the holes ready for the lugs to go back on, and now the next job is to put the badge in. Okay, here's the badge. Here's the grommet. Make sure you get the right size and the right colour. Just going to put that in. Make sure you get it the right way round as well. Align it carefully. Now all you need to do for this, I mean, I usually do this on the floor, but you need a flat surface. Ball bearing. Now that size, maybe a bit smaller, doesn't really matter. Start by tapping. That should flare out the edges of the grommet. Give it a Okay. Now, that's almost safe. All you have to do is just tap. 5 minutes, could go on like that. But about that pace, nothing stronger than that. Take your time, don't rush. Check that the badge is still in alignment. That one's gone a bit. I'm going to carry on doing that because it's going to take a little while. Then I'll show you what it looks like afterwards. Okay, so I finished doing the badge. Looks great from the front. Inside it looks, you know, neat, authentic. The trick is not to rush. Not to rush. I'm probably putting on a really hard surface. So here's the snare drum again. I left the clamps on for about 24 hours, maybe a bit more, just to make sure the glue completely set. Took the clamps off. Then I spun this edge on the board just to really get the glue off. Sanded it inside, made sure I was happy with everything, and then painted it up. And as you can see, there's no evidence of the no evidence at all really where the holes were before. It's all drilled up now. It's ready to be wrapped. I painted it slightly over the edges here. So I'm going to sort that out after it's wrapped. There's nothing else I can really do until it's actually finished being wrapped. I'm really pleased with it. The hoop was really nice and tight. I've got a feeling this is going to be a rocking snare drum. Definitely. Definitely. Right, I have here the snare drum shell. And I think one of the trickiest jobs to do on a snare drum shell is cutting the snare beds. Now, I think snare beds are a bit of a mystery to a lot of players as to why they're there, how they work, and what difference they make to the sound of a snare drum. Basically, they're cut into the bottom of the snare drum in order to provide a kind of corridor, if you like, to provide maximum contact between the snare wires and the snare head. Now, that might seem to fly in the face of all the work that we've done in order to try and get these edges level. But if you look at a snare drum with the heads on it and the snare wires on it, and include the height of the snare wires, you'll notice that it seems to be fairly level from one side of the drum to the other. So, in other words, you should treat the snare head and the wires as a form of assembly, a complete assembly. Now, I don't think there's such a thing as an average standard snare bed. I've seen snare drums where the snare bed sort of starts almost halfway round the drum and comes down gradually, tapers down to quite a deep point about where the snare wires go. And others, that's quite a modern profile. Others are just kind of like a levelling of the bearing edge around about where the snare wires go. Now, in the 60s, Ludwig's snare beds were quite crude affairs. They were cut into the bottom of the snare drum in a kind of almost random fashion. But generally speaking, it was about 3 inches by about 1/8 of an inch deep, something around about that, maybe a little more, but Ludwig had very narrow snare wires, 20 strand maybe, but they were very, very narrow. On today's snare wires can be up to 40 strands and they can be quite wide. So even simple ones are quite a lot wider. So what I've done is kind of catered for that slightly wider average snare wire width. So I've made my snare beds about 4 inches, 4.5 inches, and I've cut them. I've cut it so it's 3 mil deep. which I think in inches is between about an eighth to 3/16 deep. That's about how deep I've done it. Now, I don't think I'm going to have to do any more work on it. What I've done is just filed away that area and rounded off the edges so it doesn't cut into the snare head. Sanded it down, made it nice and smooth, just rounded the support hoop a little bit. So it looks fairly similar to a 60s snare bed, though it's slightly wider. But the important thing to remember when you buy snare wires for your snare drum is that the snare wires have to sit within this kind of corridor. As soon as they go outside of that corridor, they're going to bounce quite heavily on the snare head, and you'll get a bit of buzz and rattle. Now, the sound I'm after is quite a crisp sound. I don't really want much rattle after the initial impact from the stick. I want it to be sounding crisp and sharp, and I think that's going to sound pretty good the way it is.